Anya, a young black girl, interrupts the judge in court and says 2 words. The entire courtroom falls silent. There's something about a quiet courtroom, the weight of justice hanging in the air, the judge towering from their bench, and everyone on edge, waiting for the verdict. But what happens when a voice cuts through that silence? Not from a seasoned lawyer or a confident witness, but from a 10-year-old girl standing against the system itself. What could she possibly say that would leave a powerful judge trembling, her world unraveling in an instant? Stay with me, because what unfolded in that courtroom will not only shock you, but leave you questioning the very foundation of fairness and courage. The Ruth Good Building, a courthouse, stood as a symbol of justice, its towering columns gleaming in the morning sun. Yet, for Sarah Baker, it felt like a fortress designed to keep her on the outside. She clutched her daughter Mia's hand tightly as they passed through the heavy wooden doors. Sarah wore her best outfit, a simple navy blue blazer and matching skirt, but the confidence she tried to project felt paper-thin under the weight of the day ahead. Inside, the air was cold, sterile, and heavy with murmurs from other courtgoers. Mia, only 10 years old, walked beside her mother with a calmness beyond her years. Her tightly braided hair shimmered under the courthouse lights, and her sharp brown eyes darted around the room, taking everything in. She held a worn notebook against her chest, a makeshift journal where she scribbled everything she thought was important, things adults often ignored. Sarah knelt in front of her daughter. "Sweetheart, just stay quiet today, okay? No matter what happens, let the grown-ups handle it." Mia's lips pursed, and for a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue, but instead, she nodded. "I will, Mom." Sarah stood and smoothed her skirt, drawing a deep breath. "We'll get through this," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Mia or herself. The courtroom was a theater of tension. Rows of spectators filled the benches, their faces a mixture of indifference and curiosity. At the front of the room, Judge Susan Norton presided from her elevated bench. She was an imposing woman in her early 60s, with piercing gray eyes and a thin-lipped expression that rarely softened. Her reputation as a no-nonsense judge preceded her, but beneath her polished exterior lay rumors of favoritism, rumors Sarah couldn't afford to ignore. Sarah's ex-husband, Frank Smith, sat at the opposing table, flanked by his high-priced lawyer, Kevin Jones. Frank exuded confidence, his tailored suit fitting him like a second skin. His smirk deepened when he glanced at Sarah, as though he'd already won. Sarah's lawyer, Lisa Green, shuffled papers nervously, clearly outmatched by Jones' presence. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom stood as Judge Norton entered. Her gavel struck the bench with authority. "Be seated." Sarah felt Mia's hand brush against hers as they sat down. The small gesture grounded her, but her pulse quickened when Judge Norton spoke. "This is a custody hearing for the minor child, Mia Baker." The judge began, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Let us proceed." Kevin Jones rose, his every movement calculated to exude dominance. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter. My client, Mr. Frank Smith, is a respected businessman who can provide a stable, prosperous environment for his daughter. Unfortunately, Miss Baker, though I'm sure she's well-meaning, is financially unstable and unable to meet the child's needs." Sarah's jaw tightened as Jones' words cut into her like a blade. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, but Lisa placed a calming hand on her arm. "We'll respond," Lisa whispered. Frank leaned back in his chair, his smug expression like a victory flag. Mia's eyes flicked to him, then back to the judge, her tiny hands clenching the edge of her notebook. Jones continued, his voice dripping with faux concern. "My client only wants what's best for Mia, and given Miss Baker's history of late rent payments and," he paused, feigning reluctance, "her reliance on multiple jobs, it's clear that Mr. Smith can provide a more secure future." Sarah could feel the stares boring into her, the spectators silently judging her life. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her chin up. Lisa stood to counter, but Judge Norton interrupted before she could speak. "Miss Green, I trust your response will address the issue of stability directly. I don't need a lecture on emotional bonds." Sarah's heart sank. The tone in Norton's voice felt like a verdict already passed. Mia, sitting quietly beside her mother, began scribbling furiously in her notebook. Her sharp ears caught every word Jones and the judge exchanged. Though her mother told her to stay silent, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Frank leaned toward Jones and whispered something. Mia caught a few words. Dinner. Thanks for the help. Offshore. She frowned, her pencil pressing hard against the paper as she jotted the words down. By the time the first recess was called, Sarah felt like she was losing ground. Lisa tried to reassure her, but her words felt hollow. Across the room, Frank smiled confidently, shaking hands with Jones. Mia tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mom, I need to tell you something. Not now, sweetie, Sarah said, her voice strained. We'll talk later. But it's important, Mia insisted, her voice urgent but still soft enough not to draw attention. Sarah sighed. Please, Mia, just stay quiet and trust me. Mia slumped back in her seat, clutching her notebook tighter. She didn't understand why adults always dismissed her, especially when she knew she was right, but she also knew this wasn't the moment to push. As the courtroom reconvened, the mood shifted. Judge Norton's demeanor grew colder, her gaze lingering on Sarah with thinly veiled disdain. Frank's team moved to present their final arguments, ready to seal their victory. But Mia was watching everything, and she knew something they didn't. When the judge prepared to announce her ruling, Mia's small voice cut through the tension like a blade. You're wrong, she said. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Norton glared at the child. Excuse me. Mia stood, clutching her notebook tightly. You're wrong, and I can prove it. The courtroom was utterly still, save for the faint rustle of papers as Judge Norton adjusted her glasses. Her icy gray eyes locked onto Mia, as if the weight of her stare alone could silence the young girl. But Mia didn't waver, standing straight, her chin tilted slightly upward. She clutched her notebook tightly, the edges worn from her nervous grip. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Mia, sit down, she whispered harshly, her voice trembling, but Mia didn't move. Her small frame seemed to grow larger as she held her ground. Judge Norton's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Young lady, this is highly inappropriate. Sit down and allow the court to proceed. Mia swallowed hard, her voice shaking but resolute. I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I can't. You're about to make a mistake. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, spectators craning their necks to get a better look at the bold child. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat, leaning toward his lawyer. What's she doing? He hissed. Kevin Jones placed a hand on Frank's arm, his confidence faltering for the first time. Stay calm. She's just a kid. But Mia wasn't just a kid, not today. Sarah rose from her seat, her face pale with panic. Your Honor, please forgive my daughter. She's just overwhelmed by the situation. Mia turned to her mother, her brown eyes filled with a mixture of urgency and determination. Mom, you have to trust me. Mia, this isn't the time. Judge Norton's voice cut through their exchange. Miss Baker, control your child, or I will have her removed from the courtroom. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Mia spoke first. If you send me out, you'll never know the truth. The judge's gaze hardened, her patience wearing thin. What truth exactly do you think you know, young lady? Mia took a deep breath, steadying herself. I know what Frank did. I know how he got you to side with him. The room erupted into gasps, a wave of shock spreading like wildfire. Judge Norton's composure cracked. Her pale face betrayed a flicker of unease before she quickly masked it. That's a very serious accusation, young lady. It's not an accusation, Mia said firmly, her voice growing steadier with each word. It's the truth, and I wrote it all down. She held up her notebook, the edges frayed and covered in faint pencil smudges. Her small hand shook slightly, but her determination never faltered. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Norton's voice was quieter now, though no less sharp. Step forward. Sarah reached for Mia, desperate to pull her back, but the girl was already moving toward the front of the courtroom. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor, each step echoing in the vast space. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident facade crumbling as Mia approached the bench. What the hell is she doing? He whispered to Jones again, his voice laced with panic. Quiet. Jones snapped, his eyes fixed on the judge. Standing before Judge Norton, Mia placed the notebook on the desk with a reverence that suggested its contents were sacred. This is everything I heard, she said quietly. Dates, places, what Frank said about you. The judge stared at the notebook but didn't touch it. Her hands, resting on the edge of the bench, trembled almost imperceptibly. What, exactly, are you claiming to have overheard? Mia glanced back at her mother, who was frozen in her seat, her hands clenching the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then she turned back to the judge. "A few weeks ago, my dad had dinner with his lawyer. He didn't know I was listening. He said he had a meeting with you at the Ritz, and that everything was going to be fine because you owed him a favor." More gasps filled the room. The Ritz was a high-end restaurant in Manhattan, frequented by the city's elite. Judge Norton's face drained of color, but she quickly recovered, her voice cold. "That's quite an imagination you have." "It's not my imagination," Mia said, her voice rising slightly. "He talked about a payment, something about an offshore account. He even laughed about how it was going to seal the deal." Judge Norton's grip on her gavel tightened. "This is outrageous." But Mia wasn't done. "He said your name." He said, "Norton owes me." I wrote it all down. The courtroom was now a powder keg, ready to explode. Frank rose from his seat, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. She's just a kid. She doesn't know what she's talking about." Sarah finally found her voice. "Frank, sit down. Let her speak." Jones grabbed Frank's arm, his tone urgent. "Stop talking. Don't make this worse." But it was too late. The seed of doubt had already been planted, and every eye in the room was on Judge Norton, waiting for her response. Judge Norton's composure was unraveling, her mask of authority slipping. As she glanced toward the bailiff, "Take this child back to her seat." The bailiff hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Sarah stood up, her voice steady for the first time. "If you silence her now, Your Honor, you'll only make yourself look guilty." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of misconduct, Ms. Baker?" "I'm not accusing you of anything," Sarah said, though her voice was like steel. "But if what my daughter wrote is true, the court has a responsibility to investigate." Mia watched the exchange, her young face calm, but her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The courtroom was a storm of whispers, the murmurs growing louder with every passing second. Judge Norton sat rigid at her bench, her usually composed face betraying cracks of unease. Her gavel lay untouched, as though even she knew that trying to restore order now would be futile. Mia stood in the center of the chaos, clutching her notebook with both hands. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She knew this wasn't just about her or her mother. This was about justice. Sarah stepped closer to Mia, her maternal instincts warring with her fear of the powerful judge. She whispered, "Sweetheart, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mom," Mia whispered back, her voice firmer than Sarah expected. "I just want them to listen." Judge Norton finally raised a trembling hand, signaling for silence. The courtroom fell into an uneasy hush, all eyes fixed on the woman who was supposed to embody justice. She leaned forward slightly, her voice icy. "Miss Baker," she addressed Mia directly, "you've made a very serious claim. Do you understand the consequences of lying in a court of law?" Mia swallowed but didn't back down. "I'm not lying. Everything I said is true." Jones, Frank's lawyer, stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is a farce. We're allowing a 10-year-old to derail these proceedings with baseless accusations. This is preposterous." Frank nodded fervently beside him, but his face betrayed a sheen of sweat. His usual smugness had been replaced by a nervous energy, his leg bouncing under the table. Sarah's lawyer, Lisa Green, stood as well, her voice surprisingly steady. "Your Honor, while my colleague may dismiss the child's testimony, the specifics she provided cannot be ignored. A meeting at the Ritz, offshore accounts, these are not details a child would fabricate." Norton's lips thinned, her sharp gaze flicking between Mia, Sarah, and the lawyers. "Miss Green, are you suggesting this court halt proceedings based on the word of a child?" "I'm suggesting," Lisa said firmly, "that the allegations merit investigation. To proceed without addressing them would undermine the integrity of this court." Norton's hands gripped the edge of her bench, her knuckles white. For the first time, the cracks in her unflappable demeanor were visible to all. She glanced at Mia again, as though weighing whether the girl's testimony could truly threaten her. "Miss Baker," the judge said, her tone measured but strained, "if you truly believe what you've written in that notebook, then you will allow it to be examined. Will you hand it over?" Mia hesitated, looking to her mother for reassurance. Sarah gave a small nod, her eyes shining with pride and fear. Slowly, Mia stepped forward and placed the notebook on the clerk's desk. "Everything's in there," she said quietly, her voice steady. The clerk picked it up and handed it to Judge Norton, who hesitated before opening it. The silence in the room was suffocating as she flipped through the pages, her expression growing darker with each word she read. Suddenly, Frank stood, his voice loud and desperate. "This is absurd. She's a child. She doesn't understand what she's talking about." Sarah turned to face him, her voice sharp. "She understands more than you think, Greg. She understands honesty, which is more than I can say for you." Judge Norton slammed her gavel down, her voice cracking slightly. "Enough. Mr. Smith, sit down." Frank froze, his face flushed, before sinking back into his chair. The judge set the notebook down carefully, as though it were a fragile piece of evidence that might explode in her hands. Her face was pale now, her earlier composure eroding with each passing second. "Miss Baker," she said slowly, turning back to Mia, "you claim to have overheard this conversation between your father and his lawyer. Can you recall the exact date and location?" Mia nodded. "It was 3 weeks ago, on a Friday at his house. I was supposed to be in bed, but I couldn't sleep. I heard them in the living room." The specificity of her answer caused another ripple of murmurs in the courtroom. Lisa Green stepped forward. "Your Honor, if the child's testimony is accurate, this warrants further inquiry. I request a subpoena for financial records tied to the Ritz and any offshore accounts linked to Mr. Smith or other involved parties." Jones immediately objected. "This is outrageous. You're turning this court into a witch hunt based on the ramblings of a child." "Ramblings?" Lisa shot back, her voice rising. She provided details, dates, and locations. If Mr. Smith and Judge Norton had nothing to hide, what harm is there in verifying the claims? Judge Norton's face hardened, her authority teetering on the edge of collapse. She looked at Mia again, but this time, there was no condescension in her gaze, only calculation. "Bailiff," she said finally, her voice hollow, "escort the child back to her seat." Sarah stood as the bailiff approached Mia, her voice trembling but firm. "She's not leaving until you promise to look into this." The tension in the room was unbearable. Frank sat stiffly, his hands clenched into fists, while Jones whispered furiously in his ear. Judge Norton leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "This court is adjourned for recess. Counsel, I suggest you prepare for further proceedings." With a loud crack of the gavel, she rose and walked swiftly out of the courtroom, her robes billowing behind her. The room erupted into chaos. Spectators whispered loudly. Reporters outside the courtroom door craned their necks for information, and Frank stormed out, dragging Jones with him. Sarah knelt down beside Mia, pulling her into a tight hug. "You were amazing," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so proud of you." Mia pulled back slightly, her eyes filled with determination. "It's not over, Mom." She's scared now. "We just have to keep going." Sarah looked into her daughter's eyes, seeing not just a child but a fighter, a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. "You're right," Sarah said softly, brushing a hand over Mia's braids. "We'll keep going together." The recess was meant to last 15 minutes, but an hour had passed, and the courtroom remained in limbo. Sarah and Mia sat in tense silence at their table, surrounded by the weight of uncertainty. The whispers and murmurs in the gallery had quieted to hushed conversations, but the atmosphere felt no less charged. Sarah's gaze flickered toward the door through which Judge Norton had exited. She wasn't sure what the delay meant, but her instincts told her that the judge wasn't simply cooling off. Something was happening behind closed doors. Mia sat beside her, her notebook gone, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her legs swung slightly under the chair, a subtle reminder that, despite her bravery, she was still just a child. Yet her expression was one of quiet determination, her mind clearly working through the events of the morning. "Are you scared?" Sarah asked softly, leaning closer. Mia shook her head, though her voice was small when she replied. "Not really." "Are you?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "A little, but I'm also proud of you. You were so brave." Mia's lips curled into a faint smile, but it faded quickly. "Do you think they'll believe me?" Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. "The truth is on our side. That's all that matters." Across the room, Frank paced near his table, his face a mask of frustration. His lawyer, Jones, sat with his head bowed, furiously scribbling notes. Every few seconds, Frank would lean down to hiss something into Jones' ear, his gestures growing more frantic with each exchange. "I told you this would happen." Frank snapped under his breath. Jones didn't look up. "Calm down. We can control this." "Control this?" She knows about the meeting, how Joan's pen paused mid-sentence. It doesn't matter how. What matters is making her look unreliable. Frank glanced toward Mia and Sarah, his expression darkening. She's just a kid. How hard can it be to discredit her? Jones didn't respond, his focus now on the strategy he was hastily piecing together. The door to the judge's chambers finally opened, and the courtroom stilled. Judge Norton stepped out, her robes flowing behind her, her expression colder than before. She moved to her bench with measured precision, but the subtle tightening of her jaw betrayed her discomfort. The bailiff's voice broke the silence. All rise. Everyone stood as Norton settled into her seat. She paused, surveying the room with a critical eye before gesturing for them to sit. This court is now back in session, she announced, her voice sharp but quieter than usual. Sarah noticed the faint tremor in the judge's hand as she adjusted her papers. It was a small detail, but one that filled her with cautious hope. Judge Norton's gaze landed on Sarah and Mia. Miss Baker, you have made allegations that this court cannot ignore. However, this is a custody hearing, not a trial for corruption. I must stress the importance of maintaining the focus of these proceedings. Sarah felt her stomach sink. Was this her way of dismissing Mia's claims? But then Norton continued. That said, I have reviewed the notes provided by the child, as well as the specificity of her testimony. While I make no judgment at this time regarding the veracity of her claims, I find it prudent to order an independent inquiry into the matter. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Frank shot up from his chair. This is ridiculous. You're actually entertaining this nonsense. The judge's gaze snapped to him, her voice like ice. Mr. Smith, sit down. Another outburst, and I will hold you in contempt. Frank froze, his face red with suppressed anger, before dropping heavily into his seat. Jones rose cautiously, his tone measured. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. These allegations are serious, Norton interrupted, her voice rising. And if there is any merit to them, this court has an obligation to investigate. If you have concerns about the timeline of this case, you may file a motion to address them. Jones' mouth opened, but he seemed to think better of arguing further. He sat down, his jaw tight. Sarah exhaled a shaky breath, her grip on Mia's hand tightening. For the first time, it felt like the tide was shifting. Judge Norton turned back to Sarah's lawyer. Miss Green, you may proceed with your case. The court will consider the child's testimony as part of the overall record. Lisa nodded, rising to her feet. Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to call my next witness. As the hearing resumed, Sarah stole a glance at Mia, who was watching everything with wide, attentive eyes. Her daughter had just done something extraordinary, something few adults would have dared, and yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The courtroom settled into an uneasy rhythm as Lisa Green called Sarah to the stand. Sarah adjusted the lapels of her blazer and rose from her seat, casting a reassuring glance at Mia before walking to the witness stand. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Once seated, Sarah met Lisa's steady gaze. Her lawyer's calm demeanor gave her a flicker of confidence, though the watchful eyes of Judge Norton and Frank's looming presence at the opposing table felt like shadows creeping ever closer. Miss Baker, Lisa began, her tone measured and professional. Can you describe your current living situation? Sarah nodded, her voice clear but soft. I live in a small apartment in Queens with my daughter, Mia. It's not much, but it's home. I work as a teacher, mostly part-time, to make sure I can support her. Lisa offered an encouraging smile. And despite your work, how do you ensure Mia's well-being? I make her my priority, Sarah replied, sitting a little straighter. I plan my work around her school schedule and make sure she has everything she needs. She's a bright, independent girl, but I'm always there for her. Frank's lawyer, Jones, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he whispered to Frank. As the questioning continued, Sarah detailed her devotion to Mia, painting a picture of a loving, resilient mother doing her best under difficult circumstances. But as Lisa wrapped up her questioning, Jones stood, his every movement calculated to exude authority. Miss Baker, he began, his tone almost condescending. While I'm sure you believe you're doing your best, would you agree that your financial instability puts Mia at a disadvantage? Sarah's jaw tightened. I may not have a lot of money, but Mia is never without what she needs. Jones' lips curled into a faint smirk. Needs, perhaps, But what about opportunities? Extracurricular activities, a private education, can you provide those? Sarah's hands clenched the edge of the witness stand. Mia doesn't need a private school to succeed. She's doing well in her classes and has her sights set on big dreams. I support her in every way I can. Jones pounced. And yet you work multiple jobs, leaving her alone for long stretches of time. Wouldn't you agree that Mr. Smith, with his substantial resources and flexible schedule, could offer her a more secure environment? Sarah's heart pounded, her resolve wavering under the scrutiny. Before she could respond, a small voice rang out from the gallery. She's not alone. The courtroom stilled as all eyes turned to Mia, who had risen from her seat. Sarah's heart sank. Mia, sit down. But Mia stepped forward, her voice louder now. I'm not alone. When Mom works, she makes sure I have everything. She checks on me during her breaks, and we call each other before I go to bed. We're fine. Judge Norton's gavel struck the bench sharply. Miss Baker, you've already had your say. Return to your seat immediately. Mia's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't argue. With a quick glance at her mother, she returned to her seat, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. Jones smiled thinly, his gaze shifting back to Sarah. Your daughter is clearly protective of you, Admirable. But wouldn't you agree that her testimony reflects the burden she feels to defend you? Sarah's chest tightened. Mia isn't burdened. She's strong because she's had to be. That's what I've taught her, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Jones leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a softer, more insidious tone. And do you think that's fair, to a 10-year-old, to teach her that she has to fight your battles for you? The question hung in the air like a dagger. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the weight of his words left her momentarily speechless. Judge Norton intervened, her voice cutting through the tension. Mr. Jones, I suggest you return to the matter at hand. Jones nodded, feigning humility. Of course, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, his expression triumphant, while Sarah stepped down from the stand, her shoulders heavy with the burden of his accusations. As Sarah returned to her seat beside Mia, the little girl reached out her hand, finding her mother's. You did great, Mom, she whispered. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand, but couldn't find the words to respond. Her heart ached, both for herself and for the unfairness Mia was forced to endure at such a young age. The next phase of the hearing moved slowly, with procedural matters and evidence reviews consuming the remaining time. Yet, despite the drawn-out proceedings, Sarah felt the tide of momentum shifting against her. Judge Norton's impartial mask seemed to slip, her questions often favoring Jones' narrative, while Frank sat smugly, his confidence restored. Mia watched it all, her sharp eyes flicking between the judge and Frank. She bit her lip, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't yet know how to voice. When the court adjourned for the day, Sarah and Mia left the courthouse together, the cool evening air a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. We'll keep fighting, Mia, no matter what. Mia looked up at her mother, her expression thoughtful. I know, Mom, but we're not the only ones fighting anymore. They're scared of us. Sarah paused, her brow furrowing. Scared? Mia nodded. I saw it in their faces. The judge, Dad, Mr. Jones. They're scared because they know we're telling the truth. Sarah knelt, cupping Mia's face in her hands. Sweetheart, you've been so brave, but I don't want you to think this is your fight to win. It's mine. Mia's eyes softened, but her resolve didn't waver. It's our fight, Mom, and we're going to win it together. Sarah pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, holding on to the hope that her words were more than just a child's optimism. The following morning, the courthouse loomed once more in the crisp light of dawn. Sarah and Mia arrived early, their steps echoing through the near-empty halls. The weight of the day ahead felt heavier than ever, but Sarah was determined not to let it show. She walked with her head held high, though her hands gripped Mia's just a little too tightly. Mom, you're squeezing, Mia whispered, glancing up. Sarah immediately loosened her grip, smiling apologetically. Sorry, sweetheart. I guess I'm just a little nervous. Mia tilted her head. You don't have to be. We've got the truth on our side. Sarah paused for a moment, struck by the simplicity and power of her daughter's words. You're right, she said softly, brushing a stray braid from Mia's face. We do. They reached the courtroom doors just as Lisa Green arrived, her briefcase in one hand and a determined look in her eyes. Morning, Sarah, Mia, she said warmly, bending slightly to meet Mia's gaze. You ready to face them again? Mia nodded, her face calm, but her grip on her notebook now returned to her, tight. I'm ready. The courtroom filled quickly, the energy in the room more charged than the day before. Frank sat at his table, his polished appearance marred by the tension visible in his clenched jaw. Jones was furiously typing on his laptop, occasionally glancing toward Sarah and Mia, as if sizing up his next move. Judge Norton entered shortly after, her expression unreadable, but her presence commanding immediate silence. The bailiff's announcement cut through the room, and everyone rose, then sat as she settled behind her bench. This court is now in session, Norton said, her voice sharp and controlled. We will continue with testimony and evidence review. Miss Green, you may proceed. Lisa stood, her posture radiating confidence. Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to introduce a piece of evidence that directly supports the claims made yesterday by my client's daughter, Mia Baker. The room stilled as Lisa held up a printed document. This is a record of transactions tied to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, linked to Mr. Frank Smith. The account shows a deposit that aligns with the time frame described by Mia Baker one day after Mr. Smith's alleged dinner with Judge Norton. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by a low murmur of voices. Jones' head snapped up, his face pale, while Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jones rose immediately, his voice sharp. Objection. This is speculative at best. The connection to my client is circumstantial, and introducing it into evidence is highly prejudicial. Norton's eyes narrowed as she looked at Lisa. Miss Green, do you have any corroborating evidence to link this account to the allegations made yesterday? Lisa didn't falter. Your Honor, we have additional witnesses and evidence that will provide further clarity. I am requesting a subpoena to obtain records from the Ritz restaurant, which will confirm the meeting between Mr. Smith and parties relevant to this case. Jones' voice rose again, his tone bordering on desperation. Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to derail the custody hearing with baseless accusations. My client has nothing to hide. Mia's voice broke through the tension, quiet but firm. Then why are you so scared? All eyes turned to Mia, who sat with her hands folded on the table, her face calm despite the weight of her words. Jones' mouth opened, but no words came out. Frank glared at his daughter, his face twisted in anger. Miss Baker, Norton said, her tone sharp but not as icy as before. This is not the time for commentary. Please remain seated and quiet. Mia nodded, her gaze never wavering from Jones. The tension in the room was thick as Lisa continued. Your Honor, I believe the evidence warrants further investigation. If this court values justice, it cannot dismiss these claims without due diligence. Norton sat back, her expression unreadable as she considered the motion. For a moment, the courtroom held its collective breath. Motion granted, the judge said finally. Subpoenas will be issued for the relevant records. However, I remind all parties that this remains a custody hearing. Until conclusive evidence is presented, the focus of these proceedings will remain on the welfare of the child. Lisa nodded, her face betraying a small flicker of satisfaction. Understood, Your Honor. The rest of the day unfolded in a slow, grinding rhythm. Witnesses were called, questioned, and dismissed. Sarah testified again, this time more confidently, speaking with passion about her commitment to Mia's well-being. Jones countered with his usual attempts to undermine her credibility, but the cracks in his confidence were beginning to show. Meanwhile, Frank grew increasingly agitated, his frustration bubbling over in whispered arguments with his lawyer. Mia watched him closely, her sharp eyes catching every flicker of unease, every clenched fist and bitten lip. As the hearing drew to a close for the day, Judge Norton addressed the court. This matter is far from resolved. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the room erupted into motion. Sarah and Mia left the courthouse quietly, their steps slow and deliberate. The evening air was cool, and the city buzzed around them, oblivious to the battle being fought within those walls. Mom, Mia said as they walked, her voice soft but steady. Do you think they'll look at the restaurant records? Sarah glanced down at her daughter, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and worry. They have to, and if they do, they'll see the truth. Mia nodded, her grip on her notebook tightening. Then we're going to win. Sarah smiled, pulling her daughter closer as they continued down the busy sidewalk. Yes, sweetheart, We're going to win. The next morning, Sarah and Mia arrived early at the courthouse once again. The air felt heavier today, as though the truth they were inching toward had begun to ripple through the walls of the courtroom itself. Sarah noticed how the security guards at the entrance looked at them with a flicker of recognition now, no longer indifferent, but curious. News of the previous day's revelations had clearly begun to spread. Sarah clutched Mia's hand as they made their way to the courtroom. The little girl walked with purpose, her notebook once again tucked firmly under her arm. "Mom," Mia said, breaking the silence. "Do you think they're scared of what we know?" Sarah glanced down at her daughter, unsure how to answer. "Maybe," she said carefully, "but whether they're scared or not doesn't matter. What matters is that we're telling the truth." Mia nodded, her gaze fixed ahead. The truth always matters. The courtroom was already buzzing with low murmurs when they entered. Frank sat at his table, his expression a mix of anger and unease. His lawyer, Jones, was hunched over a pile of documents, his face tight with concentration. Sarah noticed how neither of them seemed as polished today. Frank's usual air of superiority now tinged with frustration, and Jones' confidence cracked by the growing pressure. Lisa Green was already seated at their table, reviewing her notes. She looked up as Sarah and Mia approached, offering a small smile. "Good morning," she said softly. "How are you both holding up?" "We're okay," Sarah replied, though her voice betrayed her nerves. "Just hoping today goes well." Lisa nodded. "It will. We've got the subpoenas now, and the restaurant has already confirmed the meeting took place. It's only a matter of time before the rest of the pieces fall into place." Mia perked up at that. "They confirmed it?" Lisa smiled at her. "They did. Now we just need the financial records to tie everything together." Mia glanced at Frank, her eyes narrowing. "He's going to hate that." Lisa chuckled softly. "Probably." When Judge Norton entered, the room fell silent. The bailiff's call to rise was met with a hurried shuffle as everyone stood, then sat as the judge took her seat. Norton's expression was harder to read today, her usual stern demeanor tinged with something more cautious, almost hesitant. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice steady but lacking its usual sharpness. "Miss Green, you may continue with your case." Lisa rose, her confidence palpable. "Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to revisit the allegations made by my client's daughter, Mia Baker, regarding Mr. Smith's actions. As of this morning, we have received confirmation from the Ritz restaurant that Mr. Smith and his lawyer met on the dates specified by Mia. Additionally, we are awaiting bank records that may further corroborate these claims." Jones stood abruptly, his voice tinged with irritation. "Your Honor, once again, I must object. This is a custody hearing, not a criminal trial. These delays are prejudicing my client's case." Norton raised a hand, silencing him. "Your objection is noted, Mr. Jones. However, the court has an obligation to consider all relevant information, especially when it pertains to potential misconduct. Proceed, Miss Green." As Lisa continued to outline their evidence, Sarah watched Frank closely. His usual smug demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by restless fidgeting. He whispered to Jones frequently, his agitation growing with each exchange. Mia, too, was watching, her sharp eyes following every movement, every expression. And when Frank leaned forward to whisper again, her small voice cut through the air. "He's scared," she said, loud enough for the courtroom to hear. Sarah's breath caught. "Mia," she began, but it was too late. Jones stood again, his frustration boiling over. "Your Honor, I must insist that this child stop making unfounded remarks. This is completely inappropriate." Norton's gavel struck the bench sharply. "Enough, Miss Baker. While your observations may be interesting, they are not evidence. Please refrain from speaking out of turn." Mia nodded, sinking back into her seat, but the faintest smile played on her lips. She had seen what she needed to see, Frank's face, flushed with anger, his composure unraveling. The next witness Lisa called was Mr. Tom Brown, the manager of the Ritz. A tall, thin man with graying hair, Brown approached the stand with the cautious demeanor of someone who didn't want to get involved in something messy, but knew he had no choice. "Mr. Brown," Lisa began, "can you confirm whether Mr. Frank Smith dined at your restaurant on the evening of October 14th? Brown adjusted his tie nervously. "Yes, I can confirm that, Mr. Smith and another gentleman were seated in one of our private dining rooms." "And who was this other gentleman?" Lisa asked. Brown hesitated. I don't know his name, but he was older, gray-haired. Very well dressed. He seemed important. Lisa nodded. Thank you. And can you confirm whether Mr. Smith paid for the dinner? Yes, Brown said. It was charged to his credit card. Do you have a copy of the receipt? I do. Brown handed a document to the court clerk, who passed it to Lisa. She held it up for the court to see. This receipt shows a payment for $1,275, charged to Mr. Smith's card, Lisa said. It also includes the date and the room number where the dinner took place. Jones stood again, his voice rising. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. A dinner proves nothing. Perhaps not, Lisa countered smoothly. But when combined with the testimony of Mia Baker and the forthcoming bank records, it paints a very clear picture. Judge Norton's expression tightened. She looked at Frank, her gray eyes piercing. Mr. Smith, do you have any explanation for this meeting? Frank hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for an answer. Finally, he said, it was just a business dinner, nothing more. And the payment Mia described? Norton pressed. Frank stiffened. I don't know what she's talking about. Mia leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. You're lying. The word hung in the air, soft but powerful. Frank shot her a glare, but it did nothing to shake her resolve. By the time court adjourned for the day, the tension in the room was palpable. As Sarah and Mia left, Lisa walked with them, her stride purposeful. We're making progress, she said. It's slow, but we're getting there. Sarah nodded, though the exhaustion in her eyes was evident. I just hope it's enough. Mia looked up at both of them, her voice calm but firm. It will be. They can't hide the truth forever. Sarah smiled faintly, pulling her daughter into a hug. You're right, sweetheart. They can't. As they walked out into the cool evening air, Sarah couldn't help but feel that the cracks were beginning to show. It was only a matter of time before the facade Frank and Judge Norton had built came crumbling down. The courtroom was full the next morning, the air buzzing with anticipation. Word of the previous day's testimony had spread, and the gallery was packed with curious onlookers and a few reporters. Sarah felt the weight of their stares but focused on Mia, beside her, where she sat with her notebook clutched tightly. Ready for today? Sarah whispered. Mia nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the room. We're getting closer. Across the room, Frank and his lawyer, Jones, were deep in conversation. Frank's face was pale, his usual confidence gone. Every so often, he glanced at Mia, his expression a mix of anger and fear. When Judge Norton entered, the room fell silent. She took her seat, her gavel striking the bench sharply. This court is now in session, she announced. Her tone was colder than usual, her demeanor less composed. Lisa Green stood immediately, her voice clear and firm. Your Honor, I have obtained the financial records subpoenaed from the Cayman Islands account tied to Mr. Frank Smith. These records directly corroborate the claims made by Mia Baker. She handed a folder to the court clerk, who delivered it to Judge Norton. The judge opened it, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. These records, Lisa continued, show a deposit of $250,000 into an account linked to Judge Susan Norton, dated 2 days after the meeting at the Ritz. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sarah's heart raced as she watched Judge Norton's face grow visibly paler. Jones stood abruptly, his voice raised. Your Honor, this is a baseless accusation. There is no evidence to suggest this money was tied to any misconduct. Lisa's voice was steady. The timing, the amount, and the connection to the meeting described by Mia Baker all suggest otherwise. Furthermore, we have obtained emails between Mr. Smith and his lawyer referencing a guaranteed ruling in this case. The clerk handed another set of documents to the judge. Norton's hands trembled slightly as she flipped through them. Your Honor, Lisa pressed. This evidence warrants an immediate investigation into the integrity of this trial. Judge Norton's gavel struck the bench, but it lacked its usual authority. This is highly irregular, she said, her voice faltering. This court cannot proceed based on incomplete investigations. Jones seized the opportunity, his voice loud and forceful. I move to dismiss these allegations entirely. This is a distraction designed to undermine my client's case. But before the judge could respond, Mia stood, her voice cutting through the noise. You're scared because you know it's true. All eyes turned to the young girl, her small frame standing tall against the tension in the room. Miss Baker, sit down. Norton snapped, her voice cracking. Mia didn't move. You took money to help my dad win. You thought no one would notice because I'm just a kid, but I did. Norton's composure shattered. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze locked on Mia. Finally, she rose from her seat. This court is adjourned, pending further review. The bailiff cleared the courtroom. Her gavel struck the bench, but it did little to restore order. The room erupted into chaos as spectators whispered, reporters scrambled for their notes, and Frank shouted angrily at Jones. The investigation moved quickly after that day. Within weeks, the evidence against Judge Norton and Frank Smith was undeniable. Norton was disbarred and arrested for corruption, her long career tarnished by the scandal. Frank faced charges for bribery and fraud, his reputation and business crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. Sarah was granted full custody of Mia in a retrial, overseen by a fair and impartial judge. The ruling acknowledged not only her dedication as a mother, but also the extraordinary courage of her daughter. Months later, Sarah and Mia stood outside their small apartment. It was moving day. A local civil rights organization, inspired by Mia's bravery, had helped secure a scholarship for Mia and a better home for their family. Ready to see our new house? Sarah asked, smiling down at her daughter. Mia grinned, her eyes bright with excitement. I can't wait. As they climbed into the car, Mia clutched her notebook tightly. Mom, she said softly, do you think we made a difference? Sarah reached over, brushing a hand gently over her daughter's braids. We didn't just make a difference, sweetheart. We proved that no matter how small your voice is, the truth will always be louder. Mia nodded, her heart swelling with pride. She opened her notebook and began scribbling again, her thoughts already turning to the future. Years later, Mia Baker stood on the steps of the Ruth Good Building courthouse, her black judicial robes flowing in the wind. As a newly appointed judge, she glanced up at the building that had once felt so intimidating and smiled. Her mother stood beside her, older now, but still radiating the quiet strength that had carried them through so much. You did it, Sarah said, tears in her eyes. No, Mia replied, her voice steady. We did it. Hand in hand, they walked into the courthouse together, ready to continue their fight for justice, this time from the bench. And so, with just 2 words, a brave 10-year-old girl exposed the truth and brought justice to light. Her courage reminded us all that no matter how small or powerless we may feel, standing up for what's right can make all the difference. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story. Your support helps us share these powerful moments with the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, justice always finds its way.